Hello, fellow book lovers. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you don't know me, my name is Eline. Thank you so much for clicking on my video and happy Bookmas Day 2. I am one day late uploading this video. I was supposed to upload it on the 3rd of December, but I was editing yesterday evening and I noticed there were some problems with the lighting of some of the clips, so I decided to re-record them. So here we are. So it was my plan to post every other day for Bookmas. Since I missed a day, I will upload this video one day later, being on the 4th of December. Then I'll post again on the 5th, and then I'll just resume the regular planned schedule. So I'll post on the 7th, on the 9th, etc. So, we are here for my November wrap-up. I had an insanely good reading month in November. I had multiple 5-star reads, which is already quite unique. And then I had a bunch of other books that were either 4 stars, 4.5, 4.75 even. So my average rating was also a 4.39. So that is so high. If you are interested in other statistics, then I included some of the footage of me updating my statistics page in my reading journal, so you can go and watch that. If you are not at all interested in statistics of the books I read in November, then you can skip to the timestamp that is up here on the screen. So like I said, I had a really good reading month, but there were actually also 2 books that I ended up DNFing, and I will make a separate video about every book I DNF'd in 2025, where I go a lot more in detail about the problems and issues that I had with these books, but I will address the 2 books that I DNF'd in the month of November briefly in this video as well. The first book that I DNF'd was A Fellowship of Bakers and Magic, and like I said, I'm not going to go into detail, but I had a lot of issues with this book. I will say the vibes were immaculate. It was such a cute concept for a book as well. The premise is basically a human in a magical world with a lot of magical creatures, but she doesn't have any magic herself, participating in a baking competition that is supposedly very reminiscent of the Great British Bake Off, but I haven't watched that show, so I wouldn't know. That is the premise of the book, and there is also a heavy subplot of romance. This book was just not it for me. I thought the main character was extremely annoying. I thought there were things in the plot that were extremely annoying. The side characters were annoying. A lot of things were annoying to me. And yeah, I just wouldn't recommend this. The second book that I DNF'd in the month of November was This Woven Kingdom, by the same author as the Shatter Me series. This Woven Kingdom is a young adult fantasy book, and this was actually my book club book pick for the month of November. It was already on my TBR, but that is the reason I picked it up in November. And I got to chapter 4, I think, and then I couldn't endure it any longer. Actually wanted to DNF it after a few pages because the writing style bothered me so much. And I wasn't the only one actually, because everyone in my book club had the exact same complaint, which is the writing style and the fact that the writing style is very difficult, but unnecessarily so. There were sentences that were unnecessarily long and lyrical, but it's so hard to explain. Lyrical and long sentences and complicated sentences can be a really good thing. But in this case, it just felt like she was trying too hard and it actually just didn't make any sense. And most of her sentences were just difficult to read and didn't flow well. I read aloud a few examples of these sentences to my boyfriend and he described it better than I ever could, which is that it sounds like the author gave her manuscript to ChatGPT and said, can you make this more complex so I sound smarter? Kind of like what the typical university student would do, which is write a paper, then give it to ChatGPT and say, can you make it more academic? And can you make me sound smarter before you hand it in? That's a little bit what this book felt like. And when he said that, I was just like, yes, I could not have described it any better. That is exactly what this book felt like. And on top of that, I felt like the interpunction was just completely incorrect at times. I mean, I'm no linguistic student, but I do think I know a bit about interpunction, and there were just some places in the sentences where there definitely should have been a period and there wasn't. And commas were placed where they shouldn't have or not placed where they should have. So that was also something that really bothered me. Yeah. That was the reason that I DNF'd This Woven Kingdom. Now let's get into the more positive things I have to say about the books I read this month, because there are 8 of them and I love pretty much all of them. So let's get into that. The first book that I read was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This is the second book I'm reading in the series because I read The Assassin's Blade first, which is the prequel, but was published later. I feel like every YouTuber that talks about books has already talked about Throne of Glass, but in case you haven't heard the plot synopsis of this one, this is about our main character, Selena. And Selena used to be a very feared assassin. In the beginning of this book, however, she is in captivity. And the place that she is in captivity in is horrendous and known for pretty much everyone dying within a couple of months. Then one day, the crown prince of the land that she lives in shows up and he gives her some sort of deal. Basically, she has to come with him and she becomes his representative in some sort of competition. So she has to compete against, I think, 20 or 30 others in all kinds of trials. And if she wins the competition, then she gets to work for the king as his assassin. Now, she doesn't really want to work for the king because she doesn't really like the king and she doesn't agree with his rule, but since she is in this sort of prison situation that is notorious for killing everyone, she basically doesn't have a choice. So she comes with the crown prince, and then in the rest of the book she's basically living in the castle, going through a bunch of trials while also discovering that there are some other things going on. I enjoyed this book, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed The Assassin's Blade. So I actually ended up rating this 3.5 stars, which is a good rating, but it's not a great rating, and that is basically how I felt about the book as well. I loved the characters. Selena especially, I think she is so cool. And there was another character I really loved. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He is the captain of the guard. I have been pronouncing the name as Kale, but I don't know if that's correct. The main thing I didn't like about the book was one scene kind of towards the end of the book, basically the last of the trials that is in this book. I felt like a lot of fantasy elements were introduced at the same time for the first time. It felt to me even a little bit as if Sarah J. Maas wanted to make things exciting for the finale, and so she just pulled out all these random fantastical elements that before that point in the book had not been introduced. And to me, that's not how I want to read a fantasy book. I feel like if you write a fantastical world, then sure, you can basically just do whatever you want, but you do have to introduce it properly, and you don't want it to feel like the author just randomly threw in magical things, oh, because it's a fantasy world, so I can do whatever I want. And that is what this scene felt like to me. There were characters that suddenly had powers that we didn't know they had those powers. There were things possible that we didn't know before that point were possible, and I think you can do that, but not all at once. I think there were like 5 or 6 things introduced that I was like, wait, hold up. Since when's that a possibility? So it felt a little bit like the easy way to make the book seem really interesting without it actually making any sense. So that one scene kind of did put me off and definitely lowered the rating, but it was just the one scene that bothered me, so that's why the book still gets a 3.5. I still enjoyed the book overall, and I definitely will be continuing this series, at least the next book in the series. If I feel the same about that one, I don't know. But I feel like I've heard people say that the books in this series get better. So I have good hopes for that. And I will read part 2 of the series in the next year for sure. So that was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas with a 3.5 star rating. The second book that I read this month was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. And this book, I gave it 5 stars, but honestly, if I had more stars to give, if there were more stars on the scale, it would receive all of them. I wish I could give it more than 5. Honestly, this is my favorite book of the year and possibly of all time. So, The Nightingale is a historical fiction novel that takes place during the Second World War in France, and we follow 2 sisters. They don't have much contact with each other because of some conflict between them that happened before the start of the war. But then at the start of the war, Vianne's younger sister Isabelle has to stay with her. So they are kind of forced back into contact. And I don't want to say too much more because I went in relatively blind. I think the only thing I knew was that it was about 2 sisters during the World War. And I really enjoyed going in that blind. So I'm not going to mention too much more about the plot. This book really explores family relationships. I think that is one of the main themes of the book for sure. So obviously it explores the bond between the 2 sisters, but it also quite heavily focuses on parent-child relationships. So we've got the relationship between these 2 sisters with their father, and also it focuses heavily on Vianne, the older sister's relationship with her own child, and on what it means to have a child during the World War and how far do you go to protect your child. It specifically explores women and their role in the World War, and in that it also really explores what is right and what is wrong, kind of ethics during a war situation, which is obviously very difficult and there's a lot of gray area there. And what was very interesting is that these 2 sisters have very different opinions on that matter. They have very different opinions of what is the right thing to do, and this creates a conflict between them. And what I loved about this conflict was that I could really sympathize with both sisters, which honestly, that makes the best character conflicts. I think it always creates a more interesting conflict when you understand both sides. There is one other thing I loved about this book, and if you saw my video answering bookish questions part 2, then you know exactly what I'm going to say. That is the side character, Officer Beck. He is actually a German soldier, but what I really loved was not necessarily him as a person, although also oftentimes I did, but mainly his addition to the story and the way that Kristen Hanna really shows the human side of a German soldier. And I just have never seen that being done before in a World War II book, where the German soldiers are not described as horrible people, the enemy, but a way more nuanced image in which they are actually also people and they don't always know what they're doing. They don't always agree with what they're doing. There were so many scenes between the German soldier and one of the sisters where they had such interesting conversations, and he was actually quite a sympathetic character oftentimes. I thought that was so interesting, and it added such a interesting layer to the story. I never thought I would sympathize with a German soldier so much. And don't get me wrong, he doesn't always do the right thing. He still, at the end of the day, is a German soldier, and he still works for the enemy. But there were so many moments in which he does do the right thing or does try to do the right thing, and he just comes across as very human. So that is something I definitely really loved about this book, and there's so much more, but I will make a separate spoiler video about that. That is all I will say about The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. Devastating, heart-wrenching, made me cry, like sob, but in the best way possible. 5 stars, more if I could. The next book that I read was A Queen's Game by Catherine McGee. This is a reread for me. I read it exactly a year ago when the first book came out, and then I reread it this year because the second book came out this year. This was a 5-star for me the first time, and it was a 5-star for me the second time. This book is about 3 girls that all have a connection to the royal house of the British Empire. It takes place around 1890, and it is actually based off of true events. She does tell us in the author's note that a lot of details were added and a lot of blanks were filled in by her imagination, but a lot of the broad lines are based off of true historical events. So that is super interesting. And this book follows 3 young women. I think this is actually labeled as a young adult, but I would personally say it's more of a new adults, because I think these women are all kind of in their early 20s. We follow Alix, who is Queen Victoria's favorite granddaughter, so she can expect to end up with a prince, except that the prince she's falling for is not the one she's supposed to marry. And then we also follow Helene, who is the daughter of the French exiled king, and she has an affair going on with her family's coachman, and she's kind of just someone who really likes to break the rules. Then we also have May of Teck. She is kind of one of the granddaughters of Queen Elizabeth as well, but kind of one that is always overlooked and deemed unimportant. And it is her mission because of this, and also because of her father that is kind of like mentally abusive. It is her mission to marry well and as fast as possible because she wants to get away from her father, and it is her mission, I think, to marry the crown prince of the British Empire so that she can become queen one day. So that is a little bit about the premise. This book is just filled with royal drama. It follows, like I said, 3 young women as they deal with friendship and betrayal, but also focus very much on love and secret love affairs, and it is very much focused on family expectations, especially surrounding marriage. So I think all of these women, to be honest, have some sort of secret love affair going on at some point in the book. And then it is a little bit about family relations and female friendship. But yeah, a lot of it is secret love affairs and royal drama. So it kind of gives Bridgerton, but closed door for sure. And it gives me, I wouldn't say it is like Gossip Girl per se, but it scratches that same itch for sure. So if you're someone who used to love Gossip Girl, if you like Bridgerton, but aren't necessarily in it for the explicit scenes, because you're not going to get that in this one, then I think this book really might be for you. I think I read somewhere that it said something like Gossip Girl meets The Crown. And I feel like even though I haven't watched The Crown, so I probably can't really say, I do feel like that's probably quite an accurate description of the book. I just love her writing style as well. I like the way she describes specifically dresses and ballrooms and things like that, like those kind of settings, I guess. And then I also like the way she writes about female characters. I feel like her female characters are always quite strong, but not in a fantasy protagonist, I know how to wield a sword kind of way, but in a I know what I want for my love life and I'm gonna go after it kind of way. So that is, I guess, what I want to say about A Queen's Game. That's a 5-star for me. Then I read, right after my reread, the sequel to the series, which is A Queen's Match. And it is a duology, so this also concludes the series. I gave this one a 4.75. Honestly, most of the things that I said about A Queen's Game can be said for A Queen's Match as well. And I definitely really loved this book. And I also really loved how all the plot lines came to a conclusion and how all the stories for all the girls ended. There were again some good quotes in this one, some good descriptions in this one. I loved the scenes that we got between the main characters as well. I feel like in this book we got a little bit more scenes between the 3 main characters. The reason I gave it 4.75 instead of 5, which is a minor difference of course, but it just didn't give me that exact same feeling in the beginning of the book. At the end I was fully invested again, but I just think for the first 50 to 100 pages, it was still good, but it wasn't wow. So that is why I didn't give it 5 stars, because I felt like, in comparison to the first part, the start of this book was a little bit less interesting, but then in the middle and in the end, it definitely picked up again, and I loved it once again. So 4.75, still a really, really good rating. I would definitely recommend this duology. If you like reading about young women and royal drama, then I would give this a go. Next, I finally finished Milk and Honey. I think I started this in like April or May. It is a poetry collection, so I do feel like it is quite normal to take a long time reading a poetry collection, because I mean, if you want to, you can binge a poetry collection in one day, because there are not that many words on a page, but I just feel like that is not the way that poetry should be read. And don't get me wrong, you can definitely finish a poetry collection in less than 8 months. You can finish it in like a month, I would say, for sure. And obviously depends on your own preferences, but I took a long time for this one. I ended up rating this 3 stars. The thing with this book is I really loved some of the poems, and then I really disliked a lot of the other poems, and then there were some that I just felt a bit neutral about. So there were some poems in here, like I said, that I really loved, that felt relatable, that felt creatively written, I would say. And then there was also a lot in here that I felt were just sentences. After I finished the book, I actually ended up browsing some Goodreads reviews to see what other people thought about the book. And one critique point came back time and time again, which is that what she does is she writes a sentence and then she breaks up that sentence by pressing enter at seemingly random moments in the sentence, and that's what creates the poem. Let me see if I can get an example for that one. I don't know if you can really see. It says, if you were born with the weakness to fall, you were born with the strength to rise. So that is just a sentence, and it is broken up in 4 pieces. These were the type of poems that I was really not enjoying. I feel like that's just a sentence and not a very creative or groundbreaking one at that. But then there were some poems that I actually really did love. Let me see if I can find an example of that. I don't know, this is also quite simple, to be honest, but I did put a tab at this one because I did like it. This one is, neither of us is happy, but neither of us wants to leave. So we keep breaking one another and calling it love. I like this one. And there were a lot of others that I did like. This is another one that I like. The next time you have your coffee black. See, this is an example of her pressing enter in the middle of the sentence, and it seems a little bit random. Although I still like this poem, that is something that I'm not a big fan of. The next time you have your coffee black, you'll taste the bitter state he left you in. It will make you weep, but you will never stop drinking. You'd rather have the darkest parts of him than have nothing. Yeah, honestly, I don't know how to explain why I like it, but some of them I just like. Some of them just really hit, and some of them just really didn't. And some of them also kind of annoyed me. I feel like this book is definitely more for a younger audience. I feel like this book might be perfect for girls around 16, 17, 18 maybe. I think if you're in that age range, high school age range, and you're one of those girls that really feels everything so deeply, I was one of them. Definitely, you're not the only one there. I feel like that's when this book will really hit. And I feel like maybe I was just a little bit too old for it. I don't know. I hope I explained a little bit how I thought about this book. But it was difficult because I have very mixed feelings, because it really, really, really depends on the poem. So that was Milk and Honey. Next, I read Babel by R.F. Kuang. What am I gonna say about Babel? I rated this a 4.5, so another really, really high rating. Absolutely insane how many good books I read this month. If you haven't heard the synopsis before, we follow a character named Robin, and he is born in China, but he becomes an orphan at the age of, I think, maybe 10, 11, 12-ish. And then he is taken from his home in a way that is a little bit morally questionable. Is it adoption? Is it abduction? It is vague. He's taken from his home by a professor that he quickly discovers is actually his biological father, but this professor denies that fact. And then the first part of the book, he grows up. So I think the first 2 or 3 chapters maybe are him growing up in the house of the professor, but then quickly the kind of like actual plot starts where he is enrolled for Babel, which is a prestigious university department at Oxford. This takes place in 1840-ish, I think. Definitely the early 19th century. Which was actually interesting because I obviously also read the Queen's Game and Queen's Match duology, and that took place in the 19th century as well. And Queen Victoria was an important side character in those 2 books. And then here she's also mentioned a few times. So that was funny and interesting, especially because this book kind of highlights how under her realm the British Empire does some questionable things. And then in the other book, she was written as quite a sympathetic character. So that was really funny. But also, obviously, in the other book, we read from such a different perspective because in A Queen's Game and A Queen's Match, we read from the perspective of her grandchildren. And then in this book, we read from a Chinese-born character. And in this time, the British Empire and China were at war or going to be at war. There were issues. So, back to this book and the plot and the synopsis of this book. We follow Robin in Babel, and Babel is the Institute of Translation. So basically, in this world that is heavily based off of the real 19th century England, but adds a few magical elements to that. We have a form of magic that is called silver working. And basically how silver working works is silver bars are engraved with 2 words on both sides. And these 2 words are 2 words from 2 different languages. And the magic comes from the gap in the translation. I will say, definitely keep in mind that R.F. Kuang can describe all of this way better than I can, but I'm trying my best. It is quite a complicated concept. So this is a lot about linguistics and the power of language. And in this book, the power of language is taken very literally by actually giving magic to language. So it also goes quite deep into translation. I think it has a quote somewhere as well that said, translation is always an act of betrayal or something like that, which I thought was very interesting. So it goes a little bit into detail about that as well with some examples that explains that when you translate something, you can never fully encapsulate the original text, mainly because in different languages, words cannot often be literally translated because words in different languages have slightly different connotations, or sometimes words have implications or second meanings. I'm really sidetracking a lot in the explanation of the synopsis. Anyway, so Robin goes to this Institute of Translation, and there he quickly meets his 3 classmates, because he only has 3 classmates in his whole year. And those become very, very important side characters in this book. And then we follow him on a journey in which he is very excited about Oxford and studying, and he's very passionate about his studies and linguistics. But then on the other hand, he gets approached quite early on in the book by a character that is leading a secret society called the Hermes Society. And this character basically tells him that Oxford is helping the British Empire, and it is actually very unfair and unethical what the British Empire and Babel are doing, because the translations and the silver bars are used for colonization. And so he basically has this dilemma where he feels like he is really enjoying himself and feels really passionately about Babel, but also feels like maybe he is betraying his own country because the British Empire is trying to start a war in China, and he is pulled in 2 different directions and he doesn't know what to do. So that is a little bit about the synopsis. I really, really think R.F. Kuang is just a genius, and I feel like it's going to be completely impossible for me to fully do her justice in a book review, but I will try. What I love about this book, but also about her other book that I read earlier in the year, which was Yellowface, is that she writes every character as a morally gray character. Actually, not entirely true, but like every important character. Robin himself and all the other characters that really are super important throughout the book, like his classmates, are all so morally gray. And I think that is just so much more interesting to read about than if there were to be a hero and a villain. It really makes you think so much about ethics, about right and wrong, about what you would do in a situation like this, about why people make the decisions that they make. A lot of the characters in this book are put in situations where they really have to choose between their own comfort and the greater good. And I love that this book doesn't portray these characters as, oh, of course they chose the greater good. Because I think even though that is really ideal, of course, that is also quite unrealistic. I think a lot of people would at the very least be hesitant before they join some kind of secret society that endangers their entire life. It is definitely a book that reads a little bit difficult, so if that's not something you enjoy, then maybe this book is not for you. This is a book that focuses heavily on societal topics, on ethical topics, so it makes you think, it makes you quite uncomfortable at times, and it is definitely a book that you need to use a lot of brain power to fully understand. So if reading for you is escapism from, for example, a already brain power heavy job, and this is just your relaxation for the night, then maybe this is not for you. But if you do like a book that really invokes thought and discussion, then this is something you will probably really enjoy. Another thing I really loved is that this book really poses questions that you can think about. So I think early on in the book, it poses the question of who owns a language. I thought that was super interesting. The main character and the professor that is also his father have a discussion about this. And I thought it was so interesting to think about, does a country own its own language, or is that more of a communal good? Because a language can't be stolen, of course, because if you use a language, the other people can still use it as well. But then this book adds obviously an extra layer to this discussion that we don't have in our real world, where in this book, the language also produces magic. So a big discussion point in this book is that the British Empire takes Chinese-born kids from China, forces them to share their Chinese language with the British Empire, and then they use that language to further their own colonial thing. Can't think of the word. That's obviously a very different situation than in our world, but I do think it's interesting to think about. Also, in the case of our world, can other countries use your culture, use your language? That's obviously a very hot topic, a very sensitive topic. That is just one of the examples of a question that this book makes the reader think about without necessarily forcing an answer upon you. And that is one of the things I love most about R.F. Kuang. She constantly asks you questions and then kind of shows you both sides of the discussion so that you can make up your own mind. Another question this book asks is violence necessary for revolution? And again, she shows you both sides of the discussion, and she shows you actually how both sides can go wrong as well, which I thought that was super interesting to see. So, Babel, if you like discussing a bit more complicated philosophical questions even, then this book is definitely for you. I gave it 4.5 stars. I didn't say this, but the reason that I gave it 4.5 instead of 5 is because there were a few moments in the middle specifically that I felt were a little bit long and maybe slightly dragging. Even though I think this is a masterpiece, for a book to receive 5 stars from me, I need to kind of always be excited to pick it up. So that was the reason for a 4.5, but obviously still a very, very good rating. So that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. It is again getting dark. How does this happen so quickly? It is not even 4 p.m. This is insane. Okay. The final book, oh no, the second to last book, actually, that I read this month was In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. And like I said, it was a good reading month. I gave this book 5 stars. I flew through this book. It is a mystery thriller, but I do feel like it also kind of reads like literary fiction at times. It definitely focuses heavily also on the psychology of the characters. So I think this is what you would call a psychological thriller, but don't quote me on that. This book has a sort of dual timeline situation where we follow a group of friends in the current timeline and then also 10 years prior when they were all in university together. In the current timeline, there is a college reunion So we follow them in the college reunion and also in actually when they were in college. In their final year of college, one of their friend group was murdered quite brutally, and her murder was never solved. There was one of the friend group that was accused, but he was released because there wasn't enough evidence. But basically everyone still believes that he did it, except for our main character. And then the book focuses on the solving of this murder. So it's definitely a whodunit kind of story. What I found really interesting about this was that every single character at some point seems suspicious. There were so many characters with motives. There were so many characters that had secrets, a lot of lying, a lot of betrayal, and every character felt quite well fleshed out. They were all very different. They were all very layered and complex. Our main character is very interesting as well. She is very much perfectionistic, very much focused on winning and not wanting to be second best. That is literally what her whole life is about, basically. There were definitely a bunch of plot points that I didn't see coming and a twist at the end that I never saw coming. For me, this was definitely a 5-star book. I don't know if you are regularly reading mystery thrillers, if the plot points and twists and the plot twists at the end of the book are things that you might see coming. I don't know. That is hard for me to say. I never really read mystery thrillers. So for me, I didn't really see most of these plot twists coming, and that made it such a fun experience. Yeah, that was In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. 5 stars. And then the 8th and final book that I read was actually a children's book. That is The Night I Met Father Christmas. And I did not give a rating to this book just because I don't want this book to appear in my favorites of the month or in my average rating of the month and things like that. I think I cannot really compare a children's fiction book to an adult fiction book. So that is why I chose not to rate it, as in not include it in my reading journal and in my Goodreads and stuff like that. But if I were to rate it within its genre, I would definitely give it 5 stars. I think it is a completely wholesome, wonderful, magical Christmas story. The premise is a kid wondering how Father Christmas actually became Father Christmas. So he stays up all night waiting for Father Christmas to appear in the chimney, and then he does, and then he ends up traveling with Father Christmas to deliver all the gifts. And then Father Christmas tells him the story of how he became Father Christmas. Super wholesome. Yeah, what else can I say? It is just a very well-written children's story. I read it because I wanted to read a Christmas story to get me in the Christmas spirit, but I really didn't want to pick up a rom-com because I haven't been feeling those lately, and this felt like just what I needed, to just read a magical story about Christmas presents, about Santa, and it was perfect. It delivered on what I wanted, so I'm so glad I read that. That concludes the list of books that I read in November. I hope I will ever have a reading month as good as I did in November 2025, but honestly, I doubt it. This was insane. I hope you enjoyed watching my November wrap up. If you did, please like my video and subscribe to my channel and comment down below what you read in November. Thank you so much for watching my video, and I will see you on BOOKMAS Day 3 or Day 6, Video 3. I don't know how to call it, but I really hope to see you in 2 days for another BOOKMAS video. Bye!